Let's hit the hard facts. We've got nearly 10 million Americans who have filed for unemployment in the last 2 weeks alone. The payroll plunge is 700,000 people in March, and that is just kind of a snapshot. That doesn't give you the full scope because, again, we know the unemployment is more like 10 million who are filing. The unemployment rate as of right now is at already 4.4%. They're predicting that to be at 15% and maybe even as high as 30% as this goes on.
Some of the banks are trying to give advice to their clients, to their companies, saying, you'd be better off, even though this sounds like a good package, you would be better off limiting your exposure by laying off personnel, which is not exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do with this stimulus. So, but I think you got to understand that there is this thought out there that exists that would be the safer approach for some businesses.
Well, the economy is in a bit of a free fall. The unemployment rate is expected to jump up to between 12 and 16% by this summer. Stocks have ended their worst quarter in 12 years. Central banks, led by the Fed, have been forced into emergency interventions designed to boost liquidity and credit markets. The yield on the benchmark 10-year Treasury note, which affects everything from mortgage rates to student loans, fell by 1.2 percentage points to 0.7%.
Some banks are advising their clients to not take the stimulus package because that by having to continue their operations to meet the requirements so that the loan actually is basically becomes a grant, you have to do certain things, including keep employment, keep operations. There are banks, and I don't think they're doing this in a dishonest way, advising their clients that may not be in their best interest.
I think that is true, in part because some of the provisions in the CARES Act suggest that the forgiveness provisions, will only apply to money spent during the first 8 weeks of a loan. Secondly, the employers, in order to receive forgiveness, they have to maintain their staffing and compensation levels. And so there are some provisions which would be triggered by the CARES Act, which would make it impossible to recoup or forgive the loan, meaning that these businesses would still be on the hook.
I tend to disagree with this, but I think it's industry specific. I think the immediate goal is to try to get through the next 8 weeks, right? Try to get through the next 8 weeks of keeping your employees in place and doing that. There are some industries that were hurting before this. For instance, Macy's, the retail sector, Boeing, that they have to restructure. And I think even with some of these smaller businesses, the banks are saying you're about to do this, but you really need to be restructuring.
First of all, for the loans to convert to grants that are forgiven, they do have to be used for qualified expenses, payroll, mortgage interest, rent payments, leases, utility service agreements. So you definitely want to make that calculation. But Jay, I do think it's really important to address this. I think some businesses are being scared away from taking these loans because they think that they're going to have to keep employees a lot longer than the coverage allows for. Jay, that's not how it's going to work. They're going to take this loan. They're going to have to keep employees on for 8 weeks. At the end of those 8 weeks, which is what the funds are meant to cover, that loan will be forgiven at that point. Jay, at that time, I think there will be additional stimulus, additional support available. But if they're not, the business can then make a decision after that point to shift course. So I don't want people to be prematurely scared away from taking this assistance. I think it's actually been thought out in a pretty good fashion. The reason that this is a tiered approach, there's the stimulus checks, which just about everybody gets. There's the Small Business Administration loans to try to keep people on payroll. And then there's the dramatic expansion of the unemployment insurance for people that aren't able to be kept on payroll. Jay, the intention was never that everybody would get all three of those components, but they were layered in there so that everyone would get something to try to ease the pain here. So just because you don't qualify in one particular place, I want people to understand that they were layered in so that you would get something in one faction or another.
There is a glimmer of hope, and that comes from so-called essential businesses, supermarkets and grocery stores, big box stores, pharmacies. All of those essential businesses are beginning to hire individuals.
Let's focus on the next 2 weeks. If your company qualifies for this package and you can keep your employees employed, that will help the country overall in this pandemic.